Racist doctor insults pregnant black woman. Her husband's revenge is silent but devastating. She walked into a clinic for a checkup, 6 months pregnant, alone. By the time she left, she'd been humiliated, accused of theft, and dragged to a back room like a criminal. What they didn't know, her husband was a high-ranking federal official, and he was already on his way. This isn't just about one woman, it's about how black women are treated when no one thinks they matter. Stay with us. Because what happens next will make you angry, make you think, and make you see everything differently. Pregnant black woman faces cold prejudice inside luxury clinic. It was the kind of morning that made Atlanta shimmer. A soft spring breeze moved through the city like a whispered promise. Sunlight stretched long and golden across sidewalks lined with maple trees just beginning to bloom. But on the corner of Juniper and Pontolian, where glass panels met marble floors, the warmth of the world seemed to stop. Eastbrook Women's Medical Center stood like a temple made for the elite. Polished stone glowed beneath the sun, and not a single leaf dared land on its perfectly swept steps. The building whispered quiet wealth, wealth that didn't need to welcome everyone. Danielle Carter stood at the threshold, one hand resting on her round belly, the other gently adjusting the strap of a worn brown tote bag slung over her shoulder. She was 6 months pregnant, glowing, yes, but also tired. The kind of tired that lives in your bones when the world asks you to smile before you're allowed to speak. She wore a soft blue maternity dress, nothing flashy. Just simple and clean. Her skin, a warm, deep brown, caught the sunlight like honey poured over mahogany. And yet, as she stood in front of that glistening glass door, not a single passerby offered a smile. Not the white couple who brushed past, not the older man with designer sunglasses who looked straight through her. Inside the clinic, the air was crisp with expensive perfume and antiseptic. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was controlled. Cold. Like every sound had to pass inspection before it could echo. Danielle took a breath. Her voice low, her tone tender, she whispered to her baby beneath her ribs. "All right, baby, let's get this checkup done. Daddy'll be here soon." She stepped through the automatic doors. The hush inside swallowed the sound of the world outside. At the front desk, a young blonde receptionist barely lifted her eyes from her monitor. Danielle approached with a calm she had learned the hard way. "Good morning, Danielle Carter. I have a 10:30 with Dr. Halbert." The woman's eyes finally met hers. Not rude, not kind, just assessing, like she was waiting to decide whether Danielle deserved to be here. "Dr. Hallard," she asked, pretending not to understand the name. Danielle nodded, trying to keep her smile steady. "Halbert confirmed the appointment last night." A pause, then a clipboard slid across the counter slowly, as though it had weight. "Fill this out." Danielle sat down in the waiting area, surrounded by silence and judgment. A woman with a silk scarf and diamond rings whispered to another. Her glance flicked to Danielle's belly, then down to her own purse, which she gripped tighter. An older white man, probably someone's husband, shifted in his seat, adjusting his gaze to anything but Danielle's face. Not angry, just uncomfortable, like her presence made the place feel less exclusive. Danielle's pen moved across the intake form with quiet grace, but her fingers trembled. Every tick of the clock without Ethan beside her made her feel smaller. And though she told herself again and again, "This is about the baby," the chill of the room pressed closer. There was no joy here, no celebration. Just walls filled with framed portraits of white mothers cradling newborns and flower arrangements so perfect they felt fake. The kind of place that smiled for brochures, but not for people like Danielle. She was used to this. But today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be the first time she and Ethan would see their baby's face in a 4D scan. She had imagined holding his hand, watching his eyes light up. But instead, she was here alone, and being alone in a place like this felt like walking through a museum that didn't want her there. The nurse who called her name didn't smile. She didn't greet her, she just turned and walked away, expecting Danielle to follow. The hallway was clean, spotless, too quiet, like something was trying too hard to be calm. Danielle followed, her bag clutched close, her hand gently pressed against her back. They passed rooms with soft music and soft lights, but they all felt staged, as if someone had read what a comforting clinic should look like but forgot what care actually felt like. They stopped at room 3B. The nurse opened the door with a nod and a clipped sentence. "The doctor will be with you shortly." No warmth, no welcome, just a door clicking shut behind her. Danielle stood alone in the exam room. The smell of lavender tried to mask the sharp bite of antiseptic. She sat on the edge of the examination bed and reached for her phone. 10:43 a.m. Ethan was late, but only by a few minutes. Still, in a place like this, a few minutes felt like hours. She inhaled deeply, letting her hand rest over her belly. "You're okay, baby, we're okay." But even as she said it, something inside her tightened. A quiet voice inside warned her this wasn't just a checkup, it was a test. And she knew from experience black women like her were always being tested. In the U.S., black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. Not because of biology, but because of bias, neglect, disbelief. Danielle knew this. She had read it, lived it. And yet she came today hoping this place might be different. She came with hope in her heart and her head held high. But hope, she was about to learn, wasn't enough to protect her in a place built to ignore her humanity. Because sometimes dignity is not enough to shield you from disdain. And sometimes the door you walk through doesn't open to healing, but to something colder. Something that starts with a stare and ends in accusation. And that moment was about to arrive. The insult where words become wounds. The door opened with a soft, deliberate click. It didn't creak, it didn't swing, it entered like a verdict. Dr. Lindsay Halbert stepped inside with a presence that chilled the air. Her white coat was crisp, her posture rigid, her blonde hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving knot. Her eyes were steel gray, cold, calculating. They didn't greet Danielle. They didn't acknowledge the human being in front of her. They scanned her like a puzzle piece that didn't quite belong in the box. There was a silence. Long, too long. The kind that no longer feels like protocol, it feels like judgment. Finally, in a voice that was polished but sharp, the doctor spoke. "So, you're Danielle Carter." Danielle straightened her back slightly, her voice calm but clear. "Yes, good morning. I believe we're doing the 4D scan today." "Doctor..." Halbert didn't respond, not right away. Her gaze drifted downward, not to check vital signs or observe any medical concern, but to evaluate, to assess her dress, her shoes, her presence. "You came alone." Well, the words weren't really a question. They were an accusation dressed in clinical neutrality. Danielle hesitated, just for a beat. "My husband had an emergency at work. He's on his way." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of the doctor's mouth, almost too small to notice. But Danielle saw it, felt it. "Of course," Dr. Halbert murmured, turning away to arrange a folder on the counter. Then her tone shifted. Her voice dropped half an octave, still calm, still even, but dipped in something cold and cutting. "Let me guess, you don't know who the father is, or maybe he decided this morning he was done playing daddy." Danielle froze. A pulse beat behind her ears. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Excuse me." Dr. Halbert turned back to her, arms folded. Her voice remained professional in tone, but the words were violence. Look, I don't know what kind of place you thought this was, but Eastbrook isn't a public clinic. We cater to mothers who plan, mothers who come with support, with stability, not women who show up unaccompanied, looking like they rolled in off a greyhound. The air left the room. Danielle stood slowly, her hand braced on the edge of the exam table, her voice trembling but steady. I scheduled this appointment. I confirmed it. I came here respectfully. The doctor's eyes narrowed, her lips pulled tight. You people are always respectful when you want something. Her voice dropped to a low hiss. And then you bring chaos, drama, accusations. Not today, not in my facility. Danielle felt the words slam into her, one after another. Not shouted, not screamed, but whispered cruelty carries its own weight, and somehow it cuts deeper. She wanted to yell, to defend herself. But her body remembered too many moments like this, different places, same tone, same cold eyes, same assumptions. She remembered the teacher in 6th grade who called her aggressive for asking a question. The landlord who asked if she could really afford the deposit. The nurse who skipped over her name in the ER and never apologized. Moments stacked like bricks in a wall that kept her boxed in, always having to prove she was human. She steadied her breath. I'm leaving, she said. I don't have to sit here and be insulted. Dr. Halbert stepped forward. Her voice calm, but something in her expression flickered, like control slipping. Oh, you're not going anywhere just yet. She turned toward the countertop, looked around, then tapped the space beside a box of tissues. My Cartier watch, platinum band, I left it right here this morning, and now it's gone. Danielle's eyes widened. What? I'm saying, the doctor continued slowly, each word sharpened. I've had enough charity cases walk in here and leave with more than they came in with. Danielle backed a step. Her hands hovered protectively over her belly. I didn't take anything. We'll let security sort that out, the doctor replied, already walking to the door. Before Danielle could speak again, the door clicked shut behind her. The room, once filled with icy words, now echoed with silence and disbelief. Danielle stood there, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind spiraled, trying to make sense of the sudden turn. Her heart raced, not just with anger, but fear. A fear too familiar to so many black women in places like this. Places wrapped in wealth and whiteness. Where racism doesn't come in slurs, it comes dressed in professionalism. In policy, in protocol, this wasn't just an insult. It was a weapon wielded with intent. And as the muffled footsteps outside grew louder, Danielle knew this wasn't over. The wound wasn't just personal, it was systemic, and it was coming for her. Pregnant black woman falsely accused and escorted by security. The silence in the room turned heavier with every passing second. Danielle stood frozen, her hands still resting gently over her belly, her breath tight and shallow. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes just before something goes terribly wrong. Then came the knock. Not a gentle tap, but a sharp, deliberate sound that made her heart jolt. The door swung open. 2 security officers stepped in. Both were white. One older, clipboard in hand, face drawn and tired. The other younger, built like a wall, jaw flexing as he chewed gum with slow, hostile rhythm. Neither smiled. Neither spoke for a moment. They just looked at her like she was a file they had already stamped. The older one finally cleared his throat. Miss Carter, we've had a report of missing property, Doctor. Halbert has identified you as a person of interest. You'll need to come with us. Danielle blinked. I haven't taken anything, she said, her voice cracked but stood firm. There has to be some mistake. The younger one stepped forward. We'll sort that out downstairs. Please cooperate. I'm pregnant, she said, Her hand trembled slightly as she gestured toward her stomach. "I don't feel safe being escorted like this. I'd like to speak to my husband." "He's on his way." "You'll have your chance," the older one muttered. There was no room to argue. They flanked her like walls closing in. The walk out of the exam room felt like a scene in slow motion. Danielle's feet moved, but her thoughts spun. How did it get here so fast? 1 second she was preparing to see her baby on a screen. The next, she was being walked through sterile back halls like a criminal. The hallways weren't meant for patients. These corridors were gray and narrow, lined with staff doors and cleaning closets. The air smelled of bleach and bureaucracy. She was 6 months pregnant, and still she was being treated like a threat. Every step echoed in her ears, each one a blow to her dignity. They passed an employee with a clipboard. He glanced up, saw her between the guards, then quickly looked away. No one asked if she was okay. No one questioned it. Because for far too many black women in America, guilt comes first. Proof comes later, and often never. Danielle's thoughts raced. She remembered stories, names, cases that had barely made the news. A black woman in Michigan detained for returning a dress without a receipt. A mother in Texas accused of stealing diapers she had already paid for. A student in Ohio questioned for carrying too many shopping bags. It was always the same. Suspicion wasn't earned. It was assigned, worn like skin. They reached a gray door with no label. The younger guard opened it, revealing a small, dimly lit room. A single plastic chair was bolted to the floor. Fluorescent lights flickered above. A metal desk sat under a wall of grainy monitors. "Sit," the younger one barked. Danielle lowered herself slowly, wincing as she adjusted the weight of her belly. "Please," she said softly. "I need to call my husband." "Hand over your phone," the guard snapped. Her eyes widened. "You can't. We're holding it until this is resolved." He snatched it from her hand before she could react, turned it off, and shoved it into a drawer. "You're not under arrest," said the older one, "but you are being detained for investigation. You'll have to cooperate." Danielle stared at them, her hands resting over her child. Her voice trembled, but her words did not. "This is wrong. I came here for prenatal care. I've done nothing wrong. You don't get to lock me in a room and treat me like a thief because of someone else's mistake." The younger one leaned back against the wall, arms folded, eyes flat. "Save the performance." Danielle clenched her jaw, her belly tightened, the baby shifted. As if it too could feel the danger, she inhaled slowly, in through her nose, out through her mouth, counting her breath, 3 in, 4 out. A rhythm she'd learned in childbirth class. But now it was her lifeline. She looked around. No windows, no camera, just a flickering light and 2 men who saw her as a suspect. They didn't search her. They didn't ask questions. They just kept her, held her, because they could. And as the minutes dragged on, Danielle felt her anger build, not like fire, but like ice. Controlled, focused. She thought of her husband. She thought of the promise he made the night they found out she was pregnant. "No matter where you are, no matter what happens, I'll come for you." And as she sat in that room, stripped of her voice and her rights, she knew. He was coming. The arrival, where power meets prejudice. The glass doors of Eastbrook Women's Medical Center opened with a hush, but the presence that entered cut through the silence like thunder wrapped in silk. Ethan Carter walked with measured precision, each step deliberate. He wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored sharp against his lean frame. On his lapel, a gold pin caught the light, the seal of the United States Department of Justice. He didn't need to raise his voice. He never did. His power was not in sound, but in presence. His skin was deep mahogany, his expression unreadable, but beneath it lived a storm. He scanned the front desk like a courtroom, observing every detail, measuring every silence. The same young blonde receptionist looked up. Her voice faltered. "Can I help?" "I'm looking for Danielle Carter, my wife. She had a 10:30 with Dr. Halbert." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. One moment, sir. Let me check." He didn't blink. "Please do." She typed, stalled, then looked up again. "It says she's not in the exam room anymore. There was an issue. I think security was called." "What issue?" His tone didn't rise, but something in the air shifted. She hesitated. "I'm not exactly sure. The doctor reported a missing item." "And Danielle was blamed." "I don't know the details." He leaned forward slightly. "Then find someone who does, or tell me where she is." Her breath caught. "She's in the lower-level security office." Down the corridor, past the staff elevators. He gave a single nod, then turned and walked. There was no hesitation in his stride, no panic, but his shoulders were tight, his fingers curled with restraint. Every hallway he passed seemed to part for him. Nurses stepped aside. An intern looked up, confused, and instinctively moved out of the way. Ethan Carter had walked federal courtrooms, sat across from men who thought they were untouchable, and dismantled them with 5 calm sentences and a stack of case law. But nothing hardened him more than growing up watching his mother work double shifts and still get questioned at the grocery store. Or seeing his older sister followed in a store for picking up lotion. Or hearing his cousin's screams when her voice wasn't enough to be believed. And he had promised himself, promised them all, that no one he loved would ever be left standing alone, not on his watch. He reached the end of the hall. A plain gray metal door, no label, slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was dim. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A hard plastic chair sat at the center of the room, and in it Danielle. She looked up. Her face still, but her eyes wet and burning. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He crossed the room in 2 strides, knelt beside her, rested one hand on her shoulder and another on her belly. "I'm here," he whispered. "It's over now." The younger guard straightened, startled by the sudden presence. The older one reached for the clipboard. "Can we help you, sir?" Ethan stood up, slow and steady, turning to face them. "Yes. You can start by explaining why my wife has been detained without due cause, without legal counsel, and without access to her personal property." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, gum pausing mid-chew. "She's not under arrest. Just being held." "For what?" "We received a report. The doctor's watch went missing." "So you assumed a pregnant black woman was the thief, without a shred of evidence, without even reviewing security footage." The older officer cleared his throat. "We were following protocol." "You're not trained in civil rights law." "I am." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet, flipped it open with practiced precision. Federal credentials. Department of Justice. Deputy Director, Civil Rights Enforcement. The badge gleamed under the overhead light. "I'm invoking immediate oversight. Produce the surveillance footage from every hallway, entrance, and exam room my wife passed through." "Right now." The room fell silent. Danielle's breath hitched, not from fear, but relief. The older officer nodded, stiffly turning to the wall console. He entered a code, monitors flickering to life. Ethan stepped beside Danielle, his voice low but firm. "They thought you were alone," he said. "They forgot who you belonged to." She didn't cry, she simply nodded. Her chin lifted. And for the first time since she walked into that clinic, she felt the ground beneath her hold firm. Because justice had just walked in. And this time it had a name. Surveillance footage reveals the shocking truth about the doctor's lie. The room was dim, still pulsing with tension. On the far wall, A panel of old security monitors buzzed to life as the older officer keyed in the access code with trembling fingers. His hand hovered over the mouse. No one spoke. No one breathed. Ethan stood tall, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the screens like a judge preparing for trial. "Start with the hallway outside exam room 3B, he said. The footage appeared in grayscale. Time stamps flickered at the bottom corner. The camera feed showed Danielle entering the hallway at 10:39 a.m. Her posture calm, her movements slow and measured. She opened the exam room door and disappeared inside. "Advance to 10:41, Ethan instructed. The image jumped. Now the door opened again. "Doctor." Halbert stepped out alone, glancing quickly at the tray on the side counter, then down at her wrist. Her expression sharpened. She walked briskly away, her jaw clenched. "Freeze it there," Ethan said. "Zoom in on that tray." The older guard complied, enlarging the portion of the screen near the tissue box. There in plain view sat the Cartier watch. Still, unmoved. Ethan didn't react with triumph. He didn't smirk. His voice stayed calm. "She left it behind." Danielle sat silently behind him, her hands folded over her stomach, eyes locked on the screen. "Roll it forward," Ethan said. The footage advanced to 10:52. A cleaning attendant entered the room briefly, wiped down the counter, then exited. Still, the watch remained untouched. At 10:59, the image glitched. The feed stuttered, froze, and then went black. "What happened to the camera?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp but low. The younger officer shifted, his gum now silent. "That's when the system switches over to the next shift. Sometimes there's a blind spot." "How convenient," Ethan replied. The words weren't loud, but they echoed. He turned slowly toward the drawer, opened it, and retrieved Danielle's phone. He handed it back to her with quiet care. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Then he faced the guards again. "You detained my wife with no evidence. You took her phone. You denied her the right to call for support. You escorted her through staff-only corridors like she was a criminal. And you did all of this while she was 6 months pregnant." The older officer's throat bobbed. We were just following the doctor's report," she said. "She assumed," Ethan cut in. "Based on skin, based on presence, not behavior. Not facts." He stepped forward. His voice still didn't rise, but every word struck with surgical precision. "That assumption led to a violation of federal civil rights law. It led to unlawful detainment. It risked the medical safety of a pregnant woman. And it was rooted in racial bias, whether you care to admit it or not." The younger officer looked down. For the first time since he walked into the room, his posture faltered. Danielle saw it. The flicker of doubt, the silent regret. They didn't apologize, not with words, but the air in the room shifted. The authority had changed hands. Ethan pulled a folded document from his jacket. "I'll be filing formal reports with the DOJ and the State Medical Board. I expect the footage to be secured and delivered in full. If I find out anything was altered or deleted, I will escalate." The older guard nodded stiffly. Danielle rose slowly from the chair, her back straightened. Her voice, though soft, was firm. "I came here for a checkup, and I left branded a thief." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. Because now, the evidence spoke louder than any apology ever could. Black pregnant woman faces her doctor. This time, she's not alone. The glass-walled conference room at the top floor of Eastbrook Women's Medical Center glowed under a harsh ceiling light, the kind that makes everything feel clinical and cold. Outside, the sky had darkened with late afternoon clouds, but inside, the tension burned like midday heat. Danielle walked in first. Her shoulders were back. Her face was calm, but her presence, her quiet fire, shifted the air. Ethan followed, his DOJ credentials visible in the inside pocket of his suit. Behind them, administrators murmured nervously. 3 members of the ethics board sat at the long, polished table, their expressions carefully composed but noticeably pale. And at the far end of the room sat Dr. Lindsay Halbert. Her arms were crossed, her lips pursed. She didn't rise, she didn't smile. She sat in her white coat like armor, chin tilted in defiance. But the twitch in her jaw betrayed her nerves. The board chair cleared his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we've reviewed the preliminary incident report. We understand you have material evidence you'd like to present." Ethan nodded once and placed a manila folder on the table. Inside, copies of surveillance stills, transcripts, the recorded timeline. He didn't dramatize it, he let the facts breathe. "This is the full footage," Ethan said. "It shows my wife entering the exam room, sitting alone, never approaching the counter. The Cartier watch is visible well after she's gone. The allegation was false. What followed was unlawful detention, medical neglect, and racial profiling." He paused, eyes steady, and it was deliberate. Dr. Halbert shifted in her seat. "I acted in accordance with policy," she said coldly. "There was a missing item. I did what I would have done with any patient." Danielle finally spoke. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang like a quiet bell through the room. "Any patient, or any black woman alone in a waiting room." Dr. Halbert's mouth tightened. "You're twisting this." "No," Danielle said. "You looked at me and you didn't see a woman. You didn't see a mother. You didn't see a teacher or a wife. You saw a problem, you saw a stereotype." The room went silent. Danielle stepped closer to the table, her hand gently resting over her stomach. "I came here for care. I left accused, humiliated, and held like a criminal, not because of what I did, but because of what I look like. That's not medical policy, that's a pattern." She looked directly at the board. "I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for every black woman who's been told she's too loud when she advocates for herself. For every mother whose pain was ignored. For every daughter who was judged before she opened her mouth." Ethan leaned forward. "You know this isn't isolated. Look at the numbers. Black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth. Pain is ignored, symptoms dismissed. History repeats. Henrietta Lacks denied consent. The Tuskegee men lied to for decades. That isn't history. That's the system you're still operating in." The female board member shifted uncomfortably. One of the men cleared his throat. Dr. Halbert tried to lean on authority. "I've served this clinic for over 12 years. I have never—" "You have," Danielle interrupted. "And you did it to me without hesitation." That stopped everything. The board chair finally spoke. "Given the evidence and the gravity of the complaint, we are moving to place Dr. Halbert on immediate administrative leave pending full investigation. Formal reviews of patient rights procedures and anti-bias training will begin this week." Dr. Halbert stood abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor. "This is ridiculous." But no one responded. No one stood with her. As she left the room, shoulders rigid, her footsteps echoed not in authority, but in isolation. Danielle sat back in her seat, Ethan beside her. She didn't smile. She didn't need to, because for once the room had heard her. And for the first time, someone would have to answer. Where change begins, the rain had passed. The morning after the board hearing, the sky over Atlanta stretched wide and pale blue, quiet but charged, like something had shifted beneath its silence. At the steps of Eastbrook Women's Medical Center, microphones stood like metal flowers, each one pointed toward a small podium. A small crowd had gathered. Reporters, activists, mothers pushing strollers, nurses on break. Some held signs. Some simply stood, hands folded, eyes waiting. Danielle Carter stood at the center, flanked by Ethan and two representatives from the local civil rights coalition. She wore a simple cream dress, one hand resting gently on her belly, the other gripping the edge of the podium. Her face was composed but not cold. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried like a drum beat. "Last week," she said, "I walked into this building expecting care. I left in handcuffs of silence, suspicion, and shame." The crowd leaned in. This wasn't just about me. It never was. She looked at the cameras. It's about every woman who walks into a place to heal and is treated like she doesn't belong. It's about every black mother who is forced to over-explain, to over-smile, to shrink herself to survive in systems designed without her in mind. She paused, letting the silence work. It's about the names that never made the news. The women who were humiliated behind closed doors, who were ignored when they said something felt wrong, who were handed forms instead of dignity. Danielle's eyes shone, but she did not cry. We belong in rooms of healing, in conversations about justice, in positions of power we belong. The crowd responded, not with noise but with presence. A hush fell over the steps. A mother near the front reached for her daughter's hand. A nurse in scrubs wiped the corner of her eye. Behind the podium, Ethan stood steady, pride written in every line of his face. Later that day, the clinic released a formal apology. Dr. Lindsay Halbert had been placed on indefinite administrative leave. A full internal review had begun. A new initiative was launched, mandatory anti-bias training for every employee. Patient rights guidelines were rewritten, this time with Danielle's experience at the center. But Danielle and Ethan didn't stop there. They partnered with healthcare advocates and legal scholars to push for statewide protections for pregnant patients. They drafted legislation for required bias audits in women's clinics. They met with medical boards and congressional aides, and they kept showing up, not because it was easy, but because silence had already taken enough. At home, Danielle sat on the porch one evening, her belly rising with each breath. The sun dipped behind the trees. Ethan sat beside her, fingers laced with hers. "You think it'll matter?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, his voice quiet. "It already has." She smiled, not just for herself, but for the child growing inside her. Because now, when her daughter asked what happened that day, she would be able to say, "Justice answered, and we made sure it stayed." She carried her baby through injustice. Now she holds a future. The nursery was small, but full of light. Pale yellow curtains danced gently in the open window. A mobile spun slowly above the crib, soft colors reflecting off the walls like a quiet promise. There were no crowds now, no cameras, just Danielle and Ethan, and the baby. Danielle sat in the rocker by the window, her daughter tucked against her chest, wrapped in a blanket of soft cotton and fierce legacy. The baby breathed slowly, her tiny chest rising and falling with new life, unaware of the storm she had been carried through. But Danielle remembered every second, every insult, every silence, every step down that cold corridor, and every word she had spoken when she finally stood in the light. Ethan entered the room quietly, carrying a bottle in one hand and two fingers wrapped around a folded letter. He paused, leaning against the doorframe, just watching them. "You two look good together," he said gently. Danielle smiled, tired but full. "She's calm now," she whispered. "She wasn't at first, like she could still feel what I felt, like she remembered." "She will remember," Ethan said, stepping forward. "But not the fear, not the pain. She'll remember that her mother stood, and that her father stood with her." He knelt beside them, resting a hand on Danielle's knee, and another on the baby's tiny foot. She'll grow up knowing her story began with truth. Danielle looked down at her daughter. The baby's eyes fluttered beneath her lids. A kick, small but strong, tapped gently against her mother's hand. She was never just a baby, Danielle said softly. She was the line in the sand, the moment everything changed. There was silence then, not the heavy kind from before, but a peace earned through struggle. In the months that followed, Danielle spoke at schools, hospitals, and town halls. She shared her story not for sympathy, but for clarity, for warning, for hope. She told young black girls to never lower their voices to be palatable. She told mothers to advocate fiercely and without apology. She told fathers that their presence changes rooms, changes lives. They named their daughter Nia. It means purpose, because that's what she was, a purpose born from pain. A promise wrapped in strength. To raise a black child in America is to teach her the truth early. To teach her that her skin is not a burden but a crown. To prepare her not just to survive, but to shine. To walk into rooms knowing she belongs before anyone else gets the chance to question it. Danielle and Ethan knew the road would not always be smooth, but they also knew their daughter would not walk it alone. She would walk with history behind her, with courage beneath her, and with justice beside her. And in the soft glow of that nursery, as the sun set and the city exhaled, a voice seemed to rise, not loud, not urgent, but steady, certain. When a mother stood alone, the world turned against her. But when her voice joined his, justice had no choice but to listen. And so, as the sun sets on this story, we're left with more than just a moment of justice. We're left with a reminder. A reminder that silence can wound, but truth can heal. That dignity, once denied, can rise again through courage. And that when one voice stands firm, it gives strength to many others who have been silenced for too long. Danielle's story isn't just about one woman. It's about every person who's ever been judged before being heard. It's about every black mother who walks into a room and feels the weight of centuries pressing on her back. But it's also about hope, about legacy, about a new generation being born not just from pain, but from purpose. Let this story sit with you. Let it stir something in you. Because justice isn't a moment, it's a movement. And we all have a part to play. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, anything, please take a second to like the video, subscribe to Black Unbreakable, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here, and don't go far. Because in the next videos, we'll bring you more untold stories of hardship, injustice, resilience, and breathtaking triumphs from the Black community. Stories you've never heard. Stories that will surprise you, shake you, and inspire you. Stories that prove again and again. We are unbreakable.